Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited for this interview and for you guys to get to know Parker Settecase. We had this is one of the fun things about YouTube is that you get to make new friends. And Parker and I had a great discussion last fall and discovered that we have some common interests and this whole thing of this analogy, which we're not going to call it a metaphor. Thank you for helping me with that, by the way. The analogy of God creating the world being like an author writing a story, and just all the things that that can bring up. So I'm really excited to talk about that. But Parker, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do you live? What do you do?
Yeah, so I live on campus at TEDS, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where you've spent some time yourself. And I'm currently finishing up 2 master's degrees here and pursuing a third in philosophy, Lord willing, next year. And I work for a campus ministry called Athletes in Action. It's a crew ministry. And I'm here in the Chicagoland area on a couple different campuses working with college kids.
Awesome. And so did you say a third? This is possibly a third master's degree after this one?
Yeah, I'll be pursuing a master's in philosophy. Yeah, the goal is to go on and do a PhD in philosophy. So we'll
Okay.
see.
Okay, very cool. And I think I've mentioned, but the first video of yours that I saw, I don't remember what it was, but it was something to do with a bullfrog. Is this
Yeah,
ringing any bells?
yeah, it is. So that's unfortunately that's my legacy to the world right now. I have a bullfrog video on YouTube of my giant African bullfrogs, and they're eating mice and roaches and worms, and it's got 37 or 38 million views right now. So pretty insane.
8 million views. Amazing. Well, you're making an impact one way or another. It's
That's right.
philosophy and then this and
Yeah, that's how I paid for my wife's wedding ring. So the Lord provides in mysterious ways there.
amazing. I'd forgotten it was a bullfrog eating mice. No
Yeah,
wonder.
people get pretty upset by that. Yeah,
Wow. Amazing. YouTube is a very interesting world in terms of what generates the interest sometimes. But
that's right. That's right.
yeah, so okay, so I'm going to read the title of your master's thesis. It's a master's thesis, right?
That's right.
Under Kevin Van Hooser.
Hmm.
And if I understand, it's writing about some of Van Hooser's ideas, in particular this analogy, and then just ask you to explain a little bit maybe how you got into this
Yeah.
for people who don't have any background in this whole analogy. But it's contending with the divine writer's block, Van Hooser's author analogy. I'm translating that from the Latin here, and the problem of authoring evil. So give us just a little overview of what this is about.
Yeah. So, like you said earlier, it's a way to picture the God-world relation, and there's a lot of different ways you can do that. I think the best way is thinking of God as the author of the world, and the world's like his novel. And I'd been thinking about this because I think I caught it in John Frame's systematic theology back in 2014 or something. And it just gripped me. I really liked that. And I heard it in C.S. Lewis as well. He's got an essay called The Seeing Eye. And Dorothy Sayers, she's another one. So I started catching this theme, this motif, all around. And I thought, this is really cool. I really like this. And then I read this book, Calvinism and the Problem of Evil. And James Anderson has a really nice essay in there about using this analogy to think through God's relation to sin and evil. And so I came to seminary and I wanted to do a master's systematic theology thesis under Van Hooser. And I kind of pitched this idea to him, and he goes, have you ever read Remythologizing Theology? And I was like, I'm working through it now, but I'm only halfway through, kind of interacting with Jordan Peterson's work and Van Hooser's. And he's like, keep reading because I do have some thoughts about this. And
Mhm.
he was just being generous. He's got, most of the middle of the book is all about the authorial analogy, and he was just being generous. He should have been like, hey, dummy, I've written about this a ton, but instead just keep reading that, and then we can talk. So I initially wanted to do God's relation to time, like an author in his book. And Van Hooser goes, well, immediately someone's going to talk about the problem of evil, so you should probably write this on the problem of evil. So I did, and it turns out he needed someone to do some work on that for him, thinking through a theodicy from the authorial analogy. Because if it turns out that the authorial analogy is really good for thinking about God's relation to the world, but it makes God the author of sin and evil in a really negligible way, then we should drop this. We shouldn't use this at all. So that was my project to kind of defend it.
Okay. And you use the word theodicy there.
Mhm.
Give us a little definition of that.
Yeah. So in philosophy of religion literature, There's defenses and there's theodicies. And a defense is saying, here's a possible solution to the problem of evil. Possible. I'm not saying I'm committed to it, but here's a way that God's could be, morally justified in allowing evil. And a theodicy, as it's come to be termed, is more of a positive answer. Here's what I think. Here's how I think we can solve the problem of evil. And
Mm.
so I do see this as a stronger than just a defense, but as a theodicy, yeah, an
Okay.
explanation for why is there evil in the world.
Okay. So yeah, so I'm really excited to dive into this a little bit, but the first thing I want to ask about is the dedication for
Mm,
your thesis is to your father, and it has to do with him, something about the story of Pharaoh,
mhm.
and it seemed like that was formative for you and kind of getting into some of the ideas in this topic. Could you share a little bit about how that story was relevant for you?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was young, so my dad, he knows the Lord like nobody I know. He really trusts and knows the Lord. And he would read the Bible to us all the time, taught us to love God and fear the Lord. And he was reading Exodus 9 to us. And, it's Pharaoh hardened his heart, or Pharaoh's heart was hardened, depending on the verse or the translation you're reading. And then I think by verse 12, maybe it's God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And I remember saying, Dad, that's not fair. Like, that's not fair at all. I don't understand. I understand that if God presents something to Pharaoh and he hardens his heart, stiffens his neck, yeah, that's Pharaoh's a jerk. That makes sense. But now it seems like God was hardening his heart from the outside. He was somehow like getting in there and grabbing and hardening it. And I always think of clay, and God's got the hair dryer and he's hardening this heart and he's going to break it later.
Hmm.
And my dad goes, well, son, God gave Pharaoh what he wanted. And I thought, that's not right. He wanted to relent, it seemed like, but God hardened his heart because he had all these other plagues he had to show. And so I hid in my closet for the rest of the day, just kind of afraid of God,
Mm.
afraid, like, I understand God's all powerful. I understand he's good, but I don't like the fact that he could just harden people's hearts. What the heck? And so I've thought about that most of my life. And then coming to understand Calvinism and different doctrines there, I kind of had some cognitive rest. It kind of made sense to me, but it was more of the hardline Calvinist answer. God can do whatever he wants with whomever he wants. Yeah, we're a bunch of sinners. If he wants to make vessels for dishonorable use, sure, that works. Pharaoh was that kind of vessel. But it wasn't until reading Van Hooser's work that I understood how it is that God could harden someone's heart and not be evil himself.
Mm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, fascinating. What an interesting entry point to this. Yeah, and I have found this analogy so helpful and so clarifying in so many ways. But I've also had some people who worry about the use of analogies in
Mhm.
general, and some people just take them overly literally, and other people worry, well, if you start to go with an analogy, is that going to take you too far?
Mhm.
So could you say anything about just the usefulness of analogies? Do you think it's appropriate to use analogies for God?
Yeah, yeah, and I do think not all of them, right? Not all analogies created equal, but I've gotten this same criticism that it's inappropriate. What business do we have comparing the creation to the creator? Isn't that how we create idols and stuff like this? And um, so then you say, well, look, God has called himself Father. He's described the first person of the Trinity has described himself as Father. Now, did he literally give birth? Did he father his son, the second person of the Trinity, in the same way that my Father has fathered me? Well, no, of course not. But it's an analogy between fatherhood, the archetypal fatherhood of God the Father ad intra, and fatherhood on the creaturely level. And so it's still appropriate to stretch the sense of fatherhood to fit both of those. And that's an analogy. And so then people go, well, fine, but that's an inspired analogy. God hasn't called himself an author in the Bible. So, what business do we have creating extra biblical analogies? And so what I try to parse through and what I try to think through is the use of systematic theology, what it is. And I borrow a little bit from Webster and Van Hooser and some other theologians to say, John Frame, Vern Poitras, Van Til, to say that analogies are important because it's bringing together the phenomena of Scripture into a nice package for us to understand. And the problem is not analogy in and of itself. The problem is, does this analogy properly do justice to the phenomena of Scripture? Does this go, as Van Hooser and Webster would say, like along the grain of the Bible, of the biblical text? And some do, and some don't. So it's not analogies per se that are a problem. It's getting what God says right.
Mm.
And so I think the authorial analogy gets God right in some really significant ways that help us further understand who he is, though not fully comprehend him, of course.
Right. Okay. So let's dive into that a little bit. What are some of the particular benefits that you see with this analogy? What are the pros of thinking like this?
Yeah. Well, another word just on analogies is that I see analogies as speaking literally about something, but not univocally about something. So we're not speaking in the same exact voice sense, but yeah, we are stretching the semantic meaning to fit properly two different things while still speaking literally. So I by using the authorial analogy, we can come to understand a little bit more about God and his relation to the world. And so we can look at God in time. We can look at, so if you think about Tolkien, everyone always uses Tolkien because we're good Christians and we have to. Think about Tolkien. He's writing about Bilbo and Frodo, and their climax of the story is coming up. And then, you know what? Tolkien has to run to the bathroom. And so he goes to the bathroom. But meanwhile, inside the story, Frodo and Bilbo aren't like, hey, where's Tolkien? I'm frozen. There's two different levels of reality at play. There's two
Right.
different senses of time at play. And that could really help us think about God's relation to our time, that God is like an author, writing the story, and he exists on a different level of time. It could help us think about the incarnation. I think we might talk about later.
Mhm.
God has stepped into the story. It could help us. What I think it could help us with theodicy as well. How is it that God is not responsible for our actions? Well, Tolkien and Smeagol. Is Tolkien responsible for Smeagol's actions?
Mm.
You've brought up the Calvinistic, the extra Calvinisticum, the nature of Christ. This is also with the incarnation motif, but that he's not. There's two different levels of reality. There's the character intranarratively within the story, and then there's the nature outside of the author. So it's really helpful in thinking through and explaining various points in theology in a way that's literally true, though not univocally true. So God is not an author in the sense that he's one level up in Starbucks typing away or anything like that. God authors with time and space. We author with pen and pencil, or pixels and keys. So
Yeah.
it's an analogy. It's not the exact same sense, but it is a literal way of speaking about God.
Right. Okay, that's really helpful and interesting. So we are talking literally. I like that. And Van Hooser, who I know is such a great supervisor, I've had so many friends go through and study under Van Hooser and have such a great experience. But he is helpful on how complicated the meaning of that word literal is, especially. And I've appreciated his work in Genesis 1, talking about those things. But okay, so let's talk about maybe you mentioned three issues there that'd be fun to probe into a little bit. The God's relationship to time, the incarnation, and then the problem of evil. Before we get into those, though, just to pause for a second. So someone might be listening to this and wanting to know where can I learn more or read more of what you've done on this? Now, I know your master's thesis may not be out there like a book you could buy, but is there any way someone could access some of your work on this?
Yeah, so I do have, if you go to my YouTube channel, which is Parker's Pensies, I've done a couple interviews on this, and you can go all the way down to the bottom of my page. You can see YouTube appearances. So I have that. Lord willing, I'll be turning this into a book as well. I have it out under review, kind of, to someone who's editing a new series in systematic theology, which would be fantastic. If nothing else, check out Van Hooser's Remythologizing Theology, and it won't have all the philosophical theology that I've brought in, as well as the theodicy portion at the end, but it'll give you a good sampling a really good sampling of how Van Hooser's drawing this out. And I do think Van Hooser's model of the authorial analogy is the best one out there. For various reasons. I hope we get to talk about, because he's just the man, and what he's done is really huge. And then you could send me an email, and maybe I can get you the thesis, and it's just parkerspensies@gmail.com.
Okay, perfect. And I'll put your YouTube channel in the video description for this video so people can click and check out some of your videos. You got some great interviews, so people
Oh,
should definitely
thanks.
check out your YouTube channel. You're doing awesome
Yeah,
stuff.
I've had some really good guests, as you yourself
One
now
in
can
particular,
attest.
just really.
That's right.
Okay, so here's, if I were to condense down everything that's helped me about this analogy in terms of time,
Mhm.
I could put it real succinctly, and then I'll just see how you would want to speak to this. But help me think about God when people talk about the problem of divine foreknowledge.
Mhm.
So it's like, well, how can my actions tomorrow be free if God already knows what I'm going to do?
Mhm.
And if we think about Tolkien, and I don't know why I thought of using Tolkien in my chapter on this too, but it's like the one story that we all think of, I guess. But
That's right.
if you think of Tolkien leafing ahead through the book and knowing what's going to happen 10 pages, it's not really foreknowledge.
Mm.
It's not to him, it's not happening out ahead in time. He can leaf through the book back and forth like that. And so it's one way of getting at what I talk about from Boethius is God's eternal now, his eternal present. That it's not that God
Mhm.
is strictly speaking, it's not that God is really foreknowing what's going to happen. It's just he sees it from his own eternal present. And the author
Mhm.
analogy helps me think about that a little bit. Maybe you could speak to this issue of how this analogy helps us think about God's relationship to time and what are the particular benefits you see there.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really good way of looking at it, and it also doesn't commit you to timelessness if you don't want to be a timelessness theorist. It could just be that God's level of time is different than ours. Maybe time is an attribute of God, or it's an aspect of inner Trinitarian communication, or something like that. I don't. That's a little bit above my pay grade when it comes to God's relation with time. But all you have to say is that just as Tolkien's time is different than Smeagol's time, so God's time is analogously different than our time. And so God can see the end from the beginning, like literally, because he knows the whole story. He's seen the whole story. Now, I think you can be an Arminian and believe this as well. This is kind of a mere Christianity helpful thing, and this is why C.S. Lewis uses it as well. Dorothy Sayers, who was not a Calvinist, would use the same thing as well.
Mhm.
So I think it's really helpful and ecumenical to think of it that way. Now, when you go into, how is it that he knows the story? We're going to say different things. I would say a little bit more strongly that he knows it because he's written it. And then that brings up the problem of authoring evil. Well, if he's authored the whole story, then how is he not responsible for evil? And so I think it is helpful to various degrees at different aspects, different doctrines, God's relation with time, but uh, it might just be a weaker analogy if we pull it out and apply it just to one or two doctrines. But I think it shines most as a strong explanatory analogy. It helps you conceptualize God more fully and deeper. It brings out biblical truth more deeply when you see it more systematically applying to God's relation to the world in general.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Gavin?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I want to circle back to that as well, but maybe on the incarnation, what are
Mm-hmm.
the benefits or insights that we might get about the incarnation from thinking of? So this would be like Tolkien writes himself into Middle Earth and he's walking around with Aragorn and the others and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this aspect of the authorial analogy because it really helps us think of Christ. Like, who was he? What did he do? And I think it brings out some really important and interesting aspects of John 1, that he was in the world, but the world did not know him, and the world was created by him. And it's like an author who stepped into his story, and his characters refused to acknowledge that he's the author holding everything together.
Mm.
It also brings up, it also helps flesh out some important things about Christ and, well, the extra Calvinisticum and the cross. So, God wrote the Trinity wrote Christ into the story as the main character. And as he's on the cross, he's also upholding the whole story.
Mm.
He, it's not this weak Jesus who was captured and is beaten. It's this strong Jesus who, even as he's on the cross, is still upholding the universe by the word of his mouth. That's crazy. That's a strength. That's the Lion of Judah clawing his way to the cross instead of just passively being, beaten and hurt. He's doing it intentionally, and he has the power to write whatever he wants. If he wants to write in a bunch of angels come down and save him, he could have done that, but he chose not to. So I think that's really important as well to think through. I think it draws out really interesting aspects of God, of Christ's miracles. Not all of the miracles, but a lot of them. What does he do when the storm is raging? He wakes up and he speaks to it. And that's what authors do. That's how authors create. They use their words, they use their speech acts. And so he speaks and says, be still. And he tells people they're no longer sick, and they're no longer sick. And it's like he's got the Sims, diamond above his head. He's got the power of the author in the story to make things happen within the story. And then that power is passed on to some of the disciples, and they're able to do a lot of the same miracles that he did with their voice, not by conjuring up anything differently, but by speaking the way the author has spoken. And so it's just really cool. The more you think about Christ being the author who stepped into his own reality, it shows that this isn't plan B either, right? That this was the story all along. He could have written it differently, but he chose not to.
Right. Yeah, that's fast. Yeah, this is where this analogy has been so helpful for me, because I learned in seminary that the classical theological view is that the second person of the Trinity is still doing Hebrews 1:3 and Colossians 1:17, upholding all things by his powerful word. In him all things hold together. He's still doing that during the incarnation.
Mhm.
In fact, the divine nature cannot change. He's not, nothing's going to change there. So it's this mind-boggling thought of, at the same time, how do you have Jesus as a baby in the manger, sleeping with the donkeys while he's upholding all the stars?
Yeah.
And yet he's one person. So
Mhm.
and this author story or author analogy is what helped me so much, because it's like, well, you can imagine Tolkien writing himself into the story, and
Mhm.
he's writing and he doesn't stop existing as the Tolkien in Oxford just by virtue of that fact. So
Yeah.
that was like a light bulb moment for me.
Yeah, I really like that. And it also helps us with limitations that Christ had. He didn't know the time of his return, only the Father knows, hasn't been given to him. Well, he did know in his divine nature, he's omniscient, but
Right.
not as he entered into the story in his human nature. And so, yeah, there's still the hypostatic union, but the character that Jesus is playing, that who it's truly Christ in there, and yet it hasn't been given to him. It's not part of the story that he would know that.
Mhm.
I like that a lot. Just as you said, with Tolkien writing himself in. So C.S. Lewis actually did this. He wrote himself into the space trilogy,
Yeah.
and he could have let himself know certain things or not know certain things in order for the story to make sense. And yet outside of the story, he has full knowledge of all sorts of stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, the classical theological view was always that Christ died with respect to his human nature, but with respect to his divine nature, he didn't.
Mhm.
And I always thought, well, I can affirm that, but I don't know what that means. How do you have one person, But when you think in terms of this analogy, that's why it's been so clarifying for me. That's why
Mhm.
I'm so appreciative of the insights it can bring and a lot of the stuff you're drawing out of it. So, but your main focus is the problem of evil.
Yeah.
So I can see how that comes up as a major worry that people can have with this. So tell us a little bit about why that worry comes up, and then maybe just give us a little overview of how you would respond to that worry.
Yeah. Well, so the worry comes up because, yeah, we have all these theological fruits that can be harvested and really help us think about God. But then you have to ask, what about all the bad stuff? It's fine if he writes in all this good stuff, but there's a lot of bad stuff that he chose to include in the story. And how does that not make him literally the author of evil? And the Westminster Confession of Faith says, he's not the author of evil, so we should not say that. And all sorts of other confessions talk about how God is not to be uh, sin and evil are not to be attributed to him. Even the Bible itself, God doesn't tempt with evil, nor can he be tempted. James talks about that. So that's a really big point that we want to avoid. And it seems like this might collapse it down to make God responsible for all the bad that I've done. Why? Because he wrote the story and I'm his character. And so that was a really big deal. Once I didn't want to write on that because I knew it was a hard thing, but Dr. Van Hooser said I should, because it was going to come up anyway. Um, so that's a really big deal, and that's a death blow to the analogy. If it makes God the author of evil, nope. Like I'll drop it, and we'll find something else to use. So do you want to go into how I kind of reason my way through this?
Yeah, how about real quick, because that's going to be a big question, and I got
Yeah.
a little question we can just get out of the way first.
Mhm.
Well, I don't know if it's a little question, but you mentioned earlier that Van Hooser's model is kind of, you see it as the best.
Yeah.
Could you unpack a little bit of what are the distinctives of his model?
Yeah, definitely. So all the other people we've listed thus far, Frame and who else does Wayne Grudem does this as well. C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers. They have it's an analogy, but it's I would say it's not as strong of an analogy. There's more relevant dissimilarity in theirs than there would be in Van Hooser's. And what makes Van Hooser's model so good is he parses out different types of authorship. And he's looking at Mikhail Bakhtin, who is more of a continental philosopher. And this is why it's so interesting, because he grabs that and he brings it together with some analytic philosophy and to draw out the distinctives of systematic theology. And so in parsing out three different types of authorship, we can see why Van Hooser's model is the best. So he goes through monological authorship, which is one voice. And this would be like a Tolstoy. And I haven't read a ton of Tolstoy, but from what I hear, from what I read, uh, he's a great author, but it's kind of obvious that it's Tolstoy the whole time. He's trying to teach you something, but he's not very far behind the mask of his characters. And this would be different than like a Dostoevsky. And so Dostoevsky is famously very good at creating these dialogues where the characters really pop out because they represent these like what Bakhtin calls voice ideas. But he brings in like an idea and he puts that into a character. And so now you have these ideas wrestling with each other, these dialogues. And Van Hooser parses that between two different types of polyphony instead of monologic. It's polyphonic, so there's multiple voices, and this can turn into a cacophony of voices. And this would be like what Van Hooser calls radical polyphony. This is God. This is would be like maybe process theism or something like that, where God is a character in the story. He's entered in, but he's not sovereign over the story, and he can't create it any longer. And so the characters in the story are real characters, but they have their own voice so much that the author can't really corral them and even make a coherent story. Whereas a dialogical authorship, a dialogical polyphonic authorship, is a dialogue between characters, and the author can enter into the story as one of the characters and dialogue with the others. And some people think that David Hume has done this in his essays concerning natural religion. They think he might be Philo as one of the characters, but so the difference here is that in a dialogue, the characters can interact, and you can have genuine characters that represent ideas that are not just the author's ideas. The author is not just hiding behind a thin veneer. The author can enter in, but dialogue with different ideas, and that the ideas have their own personality. And so that's just Mikhail Bakhtin's understanding of Dostoevsky that Van Hooser takes. But he says, now we make this analogy between us and God. We are not just a mask of thin veneer of God playing with toys. He's not just, he's not a monological author. He's a dialogical author, in that he's made us into answerable beings who can respond, who represent the ideas that we've come to believe and form. And he enters in and he dialogues with us. He doesn't convince us by dropping in ideas into our minds. He convinces us through reason, through you and I talking, through the still small voice that we hear, or through us interacting with scripture or the trees. And so it's really a speech heavy model, but I think it's so helpful because he's not making us do anything in the way that maybe a Tolstoy would do. He's not dropping in things against our nature that wouldn't fit with our characters. He's forming our characters through the dialogues that we have our whole lives.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting. And what just is coming to my mind right now is, as soon as you get into this analogy, very quickly this question comes up, that there's different kinds of authors and different kinds of stories. So
Yeah.
just like you're saying with the distinction between Tolstoy and Dostoevsky there. And I've even heard people, if we really want to throw a wrench into things, talk about, well, what if it's like a play rather than a novel, where the characters can embellish their script and, move around on the stage differently. And there's areas that kind of go beyond the author's purview. So it'll be interesting. But, the totally random thought that just popped into my brain. If someone's watching this and they're not a believer in God, or uncertain about God, it almost seems as though thinking about reality in terms of this analogy can give the world a lot more meaning and drama and intrigue, because if you just think the universe is just this random place that doesn't have any overarching transcendent meaning, that's pretty dark. I mean, I've contemplated that worldview. That is really grisly and dark. But if you think like of what it feels like to get lost in the really good book, a really good novel, and then you think that's what the world is like, it seems like that's a much more hopeful, meaningful way of interpreting this world that we live in.
Yeah, Gavin, I think that's huge. So Jordan Peterson talks about the world as a place of things, which science looks at, and then a forum for action. And this kind of fits more with Van Hooser's theodrama. And people resonate with that. And Peterson's been harping on this for years, saying, look, yes, science is important. The world as a place of things is important, but it's not as important as the world as a forum for action. That's where persons are at. That's where we're engaging with people and morality happens. So I think that Peterson's onto something, and I think it's because he's onto this kind of authorial analogy. Also, when someone says, everything happens for a reason, to the
Mm.
non-believers listening, hey, yeah, come on over to this view of reality. Everything absolutely does happen for a reason. Just like when you read a good book and you have no idea why the main character is going through this hard time, how is the author going to bring them out of this? And then you read the end and you realize that was awesome. Everything worked. Like, holy cow, right? That's the reality that we're living in.
Yeah, and I always think about this, that most of the movies we watch, almost every movie has the same sort of structure of good and evil fighting, and then good wins at the end.
Yeah.
And it's that and I know Sayers and others, Tolkien, have talked about this, of what if our stories are a little echo of the story?
Yeah.
What a more hopeful way of thinking, because in the stories we make up and write and read, there is incredible suffering, but it comes to a happy ending in
Yeah.
most stories. There are some movies that don't have a happy ending, but most, it's astonishing how frequently they do.
Yeah.
So it seems like a much more hopeful way of looking at the world.
Well, yeah, and Gavin, I think those stories resonate with us. Shawshank Redemption, all these kind of stories that really get us and make us weep, because I think we've been made to recognize that as the great story, the archetypal story, and of sin and evil being vanquished, but the son of the woman, being bruised in the process, his foot being bruised there. And so Joseph Campbell has thought about this, the hero with 1,000 faces, and he takes it more of a Jungian direction. And I think just, hey, follow back to the truth, that this is the story that we're living in, and this is why we have this inclination that everything happens for a reason. This is why we love to see the good guy get beat up and then vanquish the foe. Every Jackie Chan movie ever, Jackie Chan's got to get beat up before he beats the evil guy. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We get well, I was going to say Rocky Balboa, but it's
Oh yeah,
similar.
that's a good one too. Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah. Okay. So maybe you want to dive into kind of problem of evil now. How do you,
Yeah.
how do you use this analogy to respond to that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to, we can't get into all the intricacies of it on a podcast, but I wanted to make the problem a little bit more difficult. I wanted to face the hardest version. I didn't want to, sidestep it or anything. So I brought in another one of my favorite thinkers' ideas, and this is Jim Slagle, and he's got this idea of the epistemological skyhook. And so we're using all these crazy terms. We're in continental philosophy, now we're in analytic philosophy. But his idea is that determinism is self-defeating. Um, if you were determined to believe something, well, then how do you know if it's true or not? You were just determined to believe it. Why would you even think that it's true? That's kind of the basic thrust. And so then a theological determinist like myself or Dr. Van Hooser can say, well, what if we've been determined by the truth? That's a good thing. We should be determined by the truth. If I'm determined to believe what's true, that's a good thing. So then Jim Slagle motivates it more and says, in order for a belief to be justified or warranted, it has to be, you have to have an explanation for that belief. It has to be a good explanation, and it has to be your explanation. But if God is the author of the story, then it seems like the explanation would not be yours, it would be God's ultimately. Why do I have this belief that the cat's outside? Well, because God predetermined me to have that belief. And so it's not really my belief, it's God's. Well, then if I act on that, and we go into things like pro attitudes and the way we feel about things and our action, if I go and I kick that cat and I acted on this belief, well, it was God's belief. He made me believe this, and then I acted on that. But it seems like the culpability should collapse all the way back down to God. So if
Mm.
he's the author of the story, even if I was determined to believe the truth, it seems like any kind of culpability for my action goes back to God. And so I use Van Hooser's model and several other of my favorite thinkers to say there's a difference um, because of the reality of the situation. So you think about Tolkien, and if you were to say, you know what, Tolkien, you made Smeagol turn into Gollum, you're a
Mm.
wicked dude. Like, we're gonna come and arrest you for that. You made Smeagol kill Deagle, his cousin, and steal the ring. You're being arrested for murder. Everyone would laugh. That's silly. It's different levels of reality at play.
Mhm.
So there's that kind of aspect, and people go, yeah, but Smeagol wasn't real. He's not really real. And so you can ask, well, what if you found a genie and you wished that Middle Earth were real? Would the story then be a bad story? It doesn't seem like it. Knowing the end, still, it seems like it's still a good story.
Mm.
So that's not quite it. But then also the way in which God determines you to believe is not by coercing you or manipulating you.
Mhm.
He does, if he were to go beyond your rational faculties, I would say, yeah, maybe he's manipulated you, and maybe he would be culpable for that. But so I bring in this theory in philosophy of free will called guidance control, and this is by John Martin Fisher and Mark, proponents of a certain type of this. And there's two conditions: reasons responsiveness and mechanism ownership. So reasons responsiveness is just simply you respond to reasons. You think you've been presented with a reason, and you either accept that or you don't. But if you're able to respond, you can still be morally free. And if no one has bypassed the mechanisms by which you reason. So if you're an evil, scientist, and you put a chip in my head and make me vote for a certain person, I don't really own that mechanism anymore. I don't own my reasoning faculties. You do. You put a chip in my head and you're going to coerce me and manipulate me to vote in a certain way. But barring that, if it's just in the natural processes that are going on in my head and I'm still able to respond to reasons, even if I couldn't choose to do otherwise, I still have my reasons for voting the way I did.
Mhm.
And so Smeagol, even though he was determined by Tolkien to kill Deagle, he had his reasons that made sense within the story.
Mhm.
And what they were, we don't get the full story there, but maybe they were rivals growing up, and Deagle had been poking him about how he always finds things and Smeagol doesn't. And so there's a full history there that could be fleshed out to show that even though Tolkien determined it, it was still Deagle. It was still Smeagol's reasons for killing Deagle, and there was no chip or anything like that that went outside and manipulated Smeagol's actions.
Yeah.
And so, likewise with us, we have reasons of responsiveness. We're able to respond to reasons, and as long as God's not putting any kind of chip in our brain or bypassing our God-given nature, which He's developed through this process of dialogue our whole lives, then yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. God has determined us to have these certain beliefs, but he also knows exactly what to say to us when and what to present to us in order for us to act on those reasons. And so he can harden Pharaoh's heart by presenting his goodness to him. He doesn't have to go into his mind and manipulate him or anything like that. He knows Pharaoh's character. He knows his whole life. He knows how he's interacted with people, his arrogance through his whole life. And he knows that if he's presented with Moses saying, hey, God is the God of the universe, not the Nile God and not the God of the crops or anything like that, he knows that that's going to further harden Pharaoh's heart. So if he wants to harden Pharaoh's heart, he can present his goodness to him again and again, and his mercy. And
Mhm.
really, what a lot of biblical commentators say is that it was God's mercy to bring these plagues and show all the Egyptians and the Jews, hey, God is the true God, not any of these other gods that you're worshiping. And so that was an act of mercy. So there, going back to my initial question about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, he didn't do it by being evil, but by being good.
Mm.
And it fit within the story for Pharaoh's heart to be hardened and for God to continue showing all these 10 plagues.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, that was a lot.
No, no, that's all really good. I mean, so here's a worry that comes into my mind that I don't fully know the answer to, and maybe you
Mhm.
can speak to it. But someone might be out there saying, okay, so yeah, God isn't coercing Pharaoh. Pharaoh's heart is already positioned in such a way that God showing his goodness will lead Pharaoh in that direction. But God's the author of the story. So anything negative about Pharaoh ultimately traces back to decisions the author made. God made a world in which Pharaoh could become like that.
Mhm.
And so there you get to this ultimate backstop of God chose that the story would go this way, not that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And the way this analogy all kind of pushes me is to just increase caution about
Mhm.
how we think about these things, because it seems as though this analogy is helping us say the way that God's will and God's sovereignty and God's decisions work out is qualitatively different than any character in the story,
Yes.
because he's the author of it. So that's where I kind of come to at the ultimate end of the road. But
Mhm.
could you speak to this worry at all?
Yeah, and so this is a Calvinist way of thinking through the analogy. And so if you're not a Calvinist, the listeners and stuff, you might not like this. I think that this represents how the Bible represents God's relation with the world. But so there's two different levels of reality. There's two different levels of causes, and this is going back to James Anderson. There's alpha causation and beta causation. And so God's relation to the world is not the domino theory of providence. He didn't push over the first one and it all falls together. That
Mm.
would be monological authorship in my mind. That wouldn't be dialogue. And I wouldn't think that any of us would be morally responsible if that was the case, that we're just acting because we got hit by the last domino. But really, there's two different levels of reality. God authors an alpha causation by writing the story, but then within the story, intramundane, within the story, intranarratively, we have our reasons for acting. And so, um, Pharaoh has his reasons for stiffening his neck, and they have to do with his whole person, his whole character, his whole situation, leading up to that point. And so, ultimately, you can say, yes, it's because of the divine will that this has happened. Well, how is that fleshed out, though? Well, we'd have to know the full story to know how God has done that. Did God send an evil spirit to tempt him? Did God, did God put this person into his life to form this belief at this time? Well, yeah, he probably has done a lot of that, but never in an evil way, because we know God can't do what is evil. He can't tempt people with evil, nor is he himself tempted by evil. But what we see, like you said, it gives us this intellectual humility, because I'm not in the place of the author. I don't have one foot in the story and outside the story, though God authors from outside and inside as well. He's written himself into the story, not just in Christ, but in anytime he acts in the world. He wrote on the wall, he speaks to his prophets, all sorts of stuff. So God is outside and inside the story, and he can culminate our personalities through this dialogue that he does with us. And if he wants to harden some and soften others, he absolutely can do that. And especially since he's not doing it in a way that would override the person's will or would go outside of their character. Uh, so David isn't just this righteous man completely through and through, and then God makes him lust after Bathsheba. Well, that I think that would take away his moral responsibility. I don't think he'd be responsible in that case. But he wrote the story. Did he force him to do that? No, I think this is another motif of like common grace, that God restrains evil, and sometimes he doesn't restrain it as hard. Our hearts naturally are inclined, because those of us who've been born after the fall are inclined towards evil, and he restrains us, and he does this through his word. He does this through different agents within the story. And so, yeah, it's a big complex story filled with billions and billions of micro stories, plus the story of the angels going on, right? Every now and then we get a glimpse of this spiritual realm where Satan's fighting the archangels over the body of Moses, and it's, oh wow, this is a multifaceted story, and God is the author of it all, and he's acting as one of the characters as well.
Yeah, it's
I hope that
fascinating.
wasn't a punt or anything like that.
No, no, that was excellent. And it's just again coming back into my mind of how rich is a Christian way of looking at the world. Because
Yeah.
you get to see it, as you said, not only as a story, but as this huge, multifaceted story
Mhm.
that the introduction of angels and demons kind of introduces, which is interesting. But what about the problem of divine neglect? You quote Philip Clayton, I think, in your book,
Yeah.
and uh, he says the personal God does not pass the test of parental moral responsibility. If God is personal, we must conclude that God has a morally abysmal record of inaction and ineffective action. He's calling this the argument from neglect.
Mhm.
And if this is too much, we don't have to go here. But this is just for me, my
Mhm.
own personal greatest angst and struggle in working through the problem of evil is with pre-human natural evil. So we think of like animals,
Yeah.
death and disease in the animal kingdom and this kind of thing. Because when you talk about divine neglect, that's where I can understand some of the theodicies for human evil don't apply as obviously to pre-human natural evil. So you think of
Yeah.
like, why is there disease in the animal
Right.
kingdom? Why are there parasites? Why are there wasps that can eat insects so slowly by paralyzing them, and all these things that have caused so much angst for people over the years. So I don't know. Can you speak to this whole issue of Clayton's concern that if he's the author, why does he not step in and intervene more?
Yeah. Yeah. And that it also dovetails on the problem of what I've called authorial logorrhea. In logorrhea, like diarrhea, is saying too much. So why did the author have to say so much evil? And it also goes into the problem of gratuitous evil. Why? So the gratuitous evil has been fleshed out in various different ways, but by William Rowe, and Rowe kind of brought them all together. This atheistic philosopher, really sharp guy, but he talks about this tree catching fire and then in the woods and falling on a deer, just this helpless
Yeah.
doe, and just torturing this doe while it dies, slowly. And it's like, well, what point does God possibly have for that?
Mhm.
If there's a God, of course he would have to act. And so yeah, it gets back to neglect as well. Why is he neglecting his own creatures? What the heck? What positive benefit could this have at all?
Mhm.
And some folks might not like this answer, but it goes back to this response called skeptical theism. It
Mhm.
has to do with omniscience, that we're not in the place of God, and in order for us to know that there is no possible good, that this doesn't fit within the story, because that's the problem for the authorial analogy, that you find some evil that doesn't fit in the story and it makes everything fall apart. If he's
Mhm.
the author, why is he putting that in there? How is that cohesive within the story of this good God redeeming people? And so ultimately, my answer is that you'd have to be the author in order to know it doesn't fit in the story.
Yeah.
We don't have that outsideness. That's what Van Hooser uses, that God is authoring from the outside, and he's a character in the inside as well, but he knows exactly what it's going to take to shape this person into the person he wants them to be, into the character that he wants them to be. And I actually had this problem a few years back while I was in whose class? I was in the problem of evil class with Dr. Feinberg,
Mm.
and I watched this YouTube video of a tern. A tern is a bird that dives down and grabs fish, and in the spring they come through around this area. But the geese are also really aggressive during this time, and so this goose is sitting in this little marsh, and this tern, dives down and to grab a fish, and the goose, just being ornery, comes and drowns the tern. And I
Mm.
was like, what does this have to do with anything? They're not even the same species. They're not competing like for reproduction at all. The goose was just ornery and killed it for no reason. Doesn't seem to make any sense at all. And then I was thinking about it, I was praying about it, and the skeptical theist answer came up, and I said, I felt like God telling me, like, how do you know? How do you know there's no good? What if that tern had the next bird flu and was going to kill thousands of birds unless that goose drowned it at that moment, and whatever happens? I don't know the full biology. Would that even work? But the answer is I don't know. And it's not an I don't know punt answer. I don't think it's more of, it makes sense that I don't know because I'm not the author.
Mhm.
And then all you have to do is come up with a couple possible answers for, yeah, animals dying before humans. And so some might say, well, there were no animals before humans. This is kind of the young earth creationist turn, and you could say, well, God made the world as a form for action, and so he put in the appearance of age in the story. And I don't know if that's super satisfying, but a young earther could do that. An old earther might say, well, what if possibly part of the reason was for us to think about it, for us to think about, God in a different way, such that he would be revealed to us more fully.
Mm.
God is the kind of God who does this or that, or for us to question that. Some people with the hiddenness problem would say that if God weren't hidden, this is also authorial neglect. Philip Clayton's neglect argument is very similar to the argument from divine hiddenness. If God were too close to us, then no one would really have a choice in believing him or not. And so there's kind of a free will answer there too. So you could say, well, if there were no animal suffering prior to humans, then we would so obviously believe in God that it wouldn't be a free choice whether we want to believe. Now, I wouldn't probably go that direction, but people can do that. And so all you have to do is provide a plausible solution and say, look, I would have to be in the spot of the author in order to know this. But the fact that you and I are reasoning about it right now might be evidence that God was using that in order for us to think more deeply about him. And because ultimately that's the answer I want to give with the theodicy. Why is there evil and suffering in the world? God has a greater purpose for it. Well, what's the greatest purpose? What's the greater purpose that he could possibly allow? Well, further revealing himself. So without the evil of Satan, without the fall of humanity, you don't get to see God as a redeeming God. You
Mm.
don't get to see God as a God who steps in the story and suffers for our sake. You don't get to see him in the full revelation of his attributes that we do get to see because of the cross. And we don't get to see the eschaton. And so, yeah, the story necessitated those kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think, and this is just coming again to my mind right now, because as I read through your master's thesis, that word outsideness
Mm,
kept coming up, and I so appreciated that because it's this effect of humbling us. It
yeah.
seems. Do you agree that humility is a really important piece of responding to the problem of evil?
Yeah, I do think so, because I've seen what lack of humility does, and oftentimes it leads us to neuter our theology or cut off all the sharp edges instead of going in deeper. And I think this answer, following Van Hooser and James Anderson and the theologians who've done this, is a deepening of theology. And they say, look, we're not punting, we're not trying to skirt the issue. What we're saying, because God is incomprehensible, because there is a creator creature distinction, an author authee, author character distinction, it makes sense we wouldn't be able to have all the answers. And so I'm not going to cut down my view of the author to try and fully grasp something that he's told us is not fully graspable.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean we won't ever know the answer. So
Mhm.
maybe we won't, but also, you've mentioned Tolkien's view of this earlier. He talks about a eucatastrophe
Yeah.
instead of a catastrophe, but you stress a good catastrophe where all evil comes undone and everything comes together and it makes sense. And I think that's ultimately what the eschaton is, that we'll see, oh God, that's why I broke my arm in third grade. That's why you allowed this or that. I see it now. And you're amazing for allowing that. And even for allowing me to go through that. How
Mhm.
many of us would jump in and go, no, 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 I can't let this person hurt anymore.
Yeah.
But God knew the good that he was going to do and was patient enough to allow that to happen.
Yeah. Okay, this will be the last question or last kind of my remarks here, and then invite you to comment on this whole idea of eucatastrophe. This is such a hopeful and happy thought for me, that if you think of it like this, like in the Lord of the Rings, like you can truly imagine that Frodo at the end of the story is glad for all that he went through
Mm,
because of what it ultimately resulted in. Like you can truly imagine that there's a scenario where you could get to the end and be glad for what you suffered, and be
mm,
glad for, because now what makes me cautious about that, and where I get nervous and where I understand the skeptic's feeling of angst about that, is, there's a passage in Dostoevsky where, in the Brothers Karamazov, where he's talking about uh, he's talking about horrific evil, like a child suffering
yeah,
something terrible. And he basically says the character, so it's not, again, like you said, it's not Dostoevsky himself, but the
yeah,
character Ivan is saying,
mhm,
I believe that all suffering will be redeemed, and I still reject it. Nothing could make this okay. No future redemption could redeem. So I'm just sensitive to that. And I'm sensitive to those who want to say about the problem of evil, like there are some things that are so terrible that don't even go there. Don't try to make it okay. Don't try to say something could make up for it. I'm kind of sensitive to that worry. Nonetheless, this whole idea of eucatastrophe seems so striking, and it seems like a way that the author analogy kind of speaks to the problem of evil. So maybe any final remarks you want to say about just, do you think this appeal to eucatastrophe is a cogent response to the problem of evil?
Yeah, yeah. So I do think it's cogent. I think it's cogent on God's revelation. He's revealed it to us so we can, but he's also given us more than that. He's given us the worst evil in history of the cross, and I think you have to do it. You have to do it justice to draw out how evil that was. The
Mm,
only perfect human ever was murdered. He was the God man. He was the author, stepped into his world, into his story, and we killed him.
mm,
And so like the worst possible evil ever, God and man, you know, the redeemer come down is murdered brutally, and it's the worst evil that there ever could have been. There's some really really bad evils out there, and you could debate about those, but if you will just take for the sake of argument that Christ existed, that he was truly God, truly man, then you would see that this is the worst evil. And so we've seen that God took the worst evil ever and brought about the greatest good from that, salvation for anyone who trusts in him, and the redemption of not just humanity but of all things. He redeemed his image bearers, and he's promised us, whether he's doing that now or there's a future time, that he will make all things new again and we'll have this new creation. So we've seen that God, from Revelation, we've seen that God has done it with the worst possible evil and brought about this greatest good, this eucatastrophe that has been inaugurated. If he can do that with that, then he can do it with the lesser amounts of evil that we experience in life. And
mhm.
I say lesser really, like, I don't want to be flippant at all. There's some genuine, terrible, terrible, wicked vileness. But I want to give the listeners hope that if God can do it with the worst, he can do it with the lesser ones. He
Yeah.
can do them with less than worst, right? Maybe it's right there with it, but we've seen him do it with the worst, so he can do it. He's the kind of God who can bring a eucatastrophe out of a genuine catastrophe.
That's such a good answer. I'm so glad we landed it here on the cross, because I think that's such a wonderful, helpful way pastorally to help kind of steer us on this issue. And here's a concluding appeal for people watching this, kind of maybe wrestling with this topic of just a what if. Like, if you think of how joyful Easter morning is, can
Mm,
you imagine the joy of being Mary and seeing him? And he's
yeah.
got the holes in his wrists, and it's him, and he's alive. And not only was the suffering ended, but it was actually transformed into glory.
Mm,
The appeal is, what if, you know, that
yeah.
that's a little picture of actually what God can do for all who trust in him with their and with what they go through. Whew, it's at least worth considering, even if you're not convinced, because it's a worldview that gives an incredible amount of hope. Um, so
Yeah.
anyway, I love this conversation. Thank you so much, and I want to keep talking. As you get into other things. And the final thing of just, where can people? Would it just be your YouTube channel that I'll put in the video description? That'd be the main point of contact. Is there anything else where people can follow your work?
Yeah, so I also have a blog called Parker's Pensies, and you can find that blog where I've uploaded a lot of my master's papers and just blogs I'm working on since 2016, and that kind of blossomed into the YouTube channel. If you don't like YouTube, you like Apple Podcasts. Well, you're listening to this on YouTube probably, but you can find it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all that good stuff. YouTube will have most of my stuff. I'm working through Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order right now, and that's only on YouTube. So if you want to follow along with that, you can too. Yeah,
Perfect. Awesome. I'll put the blog in the video description as well.
awesome.
And hey, this has been really fascinating. Thanks a lot, Parker.
Yeah, dude, thanks for having me on. Again, it's a huge honor to be talking with you about this, and I appreciate your work on this as well. And dude, it's awesome. I want to continue the conversation as well. I always love talking with you.
Yeah, I know it goes so fast. Well, we'll do another one soon.
Awesome.